And joining us now on the line from Boston, Massachusetts is Ellen Ruppel, author of Cheap, the High Cost of Discount Culture. Ellen, it's good to meet you. How are you tonight?
I'm great. How are you?
Excellent, thank you very much. But I want to start talking about the culture of cheap here. You start your book off with a rather dramatic claim that America has what you might call a dangerous liaison with capital C, cheap. What is so dangerous about wanting to get more for your money?
Well, you know, there used to be an old proverb, a Russian proverb, that was, "I'm too poor to be cheap." And in fact, I think a lot of us know almost intuitively that you get what you pay for, what our parents would say, our grandparents would say. But for some reason, in the last few decades, we've kind of gotten away from that idea. We've gotten into the idea that the lowest price will give us the best value. And what I found out in my course of researching this book, which took about 3 years, was that in fact, you do get what you pay for, and oftentimes that's not what you expected. Well, and there's some very, very serious consequences of our pursuit of cheap.
I suspect our parents and grandparents would also say, if not cheap, thrifty is good. Is there a difference between cheap and thrifty?
There's a world of difference between cheap and thrifty, or frugal, as I say in the book. Frugality or thrift is someone who looks for value in what they buy. They understand their purchasers, they understand why they're buying their purchases, and they also understand that what they buy, is, if it is of quality, required the work of others, and therefore would not necessarily be the lowest possible price.
Let me put a question to you after reading an excerpt from your book here. Here's the excerpt. Cheap fuel, cheap loans, cheap consumer goods do not pave the road to salvation. Our Faustian pact with bargains contributed to the worst recession of 2 generations. The economics of cheap cramps innovation, contributes to the decline of once flourishing industries, and threatens our proud heritage of craftsmanship. And I want to ask you about that last word. How important is craftsmanship in a society that is as mobile and fast-changing as ours? For example, you know, do we really want an iPod that'll last for 20 years or a pair of pants that'll last for 20 years? That kind of thing.
Well, you know, that's a question that each individual has to answer for his or herself. But I think a lot of times we make purchases with the assumption that the purchase will do the job that we hope it will do, and it will last a given amount of time. In other words, until we want to purchase a new one. And all too often, we find that when we go to the lowest possible price, we are disappointed in the purchases that we make. And this is why we average about, for example, a new piece of clothing every 5.5 days. Americans purchase a new piece of clothing on average about every 5.5 days. That's an enormous amount of clothing. And in the book, I discuss why we perhaps do that. Oftentimes, we're disappointed with our purchases and tend to overbuy and overspend because we're not happy with what we've bought. So, you know, what you said is true. We are a mobile culture, and we have gotten used to some level of disposability, and we like new things all the time. But oftentimes, this has come back to haunt us in the form of waste, environmental degradation, and economic difficulties.
Walmart is an easy and predictable target, so I'm not going to ask you about Walmart. But I am going to take you overseas for a second and ask you about a Swedish company we all know called Ikea. And I guess, which is one of the targets in your book as well. I wonder whether cheap is a worldwide phenomenon as opposed to just being something that we tend to think of as perhaps being a more North American phenomenon.
Well, it's something that had its roots here in our discount culture, and I discussed the history of that, Woolworths and Wanamaker's and other sort of pioneers of cheap, some good and some not so good. But of course, it has spread internationally, and it's got its roots. It's spread its roots and its tentacles around the globe. It's been able to gather more force in some places than others. In the case of Ikea, that's an international firm. Obviously, it is the largest retailer of furniture in the world. It is a huge company, and I went there because I was interested in looking at a company that has some cachet as opposed to Walmart. Many of us are kind of sick of hearing about the difficulties we might encounter at Walmart. But Ikea, at least we in North America, think of that as kind of a chic firm and a young and hip firm. And I wanted to go across across the Atlantic, take a look myself and see how Ikea manages to sell what it does at the price that it sells it for. And I've learned quite a few interesting things on my trip there.
I'm going to follow up with a question on that, but first I want to show you and our viewers. This was an ad done in 2002 for Ikea, directed by the well-known movie director Spike Jonze. And it got a lot of attention at the time and still stands up. Let's take a look at this and then we'll come back and talk. Roll tape, please.
Many of you feel bad for this lamp. That is because you're crazy. It has no feelings, and the new one is much better.
Now, even as one of our cameramen in the studio was looking at that ad saying, poor little lamp. But new is much better is obviously the, the message that you take out of there. And, what in your trip to Sweden when you went to Ikea made you question its role in our consumer culture?
Well, Ikea is a very, very interesting firm. They design to price, so that they set a price for their objects, and then they go out and they find someone to make those objects at the designated price. They have a bevy of wonderful designers who design these objects. They design them with whatever materials it takes to get to this price. And they don't look necessarily for durability or longevity, as that commercial, that wonderful commercial, actually makes quite clear. In fact, Ikea is famous for naming the things it sells with all different sorts of cute names. And so they do actually want you to develop a fondness, an affinity for their products, but then they want your relationship to be quick and finish soon, and so you will come back and buy a new object, okay? And again, of course, this varies tremendously with their inventory, which is quite large. But there's no question that they are selling to young people, if possible, with the idea that they will be able to buy new things quite quickly, that these things are essentially disposable, and they're not made necessarily to last for a long time. Sometimes they do, but they're not made with that in mind.
Still on the issue of new, let me ask you about another assertion you make in the book, and that is that a consumer culture which relies on the turnover of goods stifles, you say, stifles innovation rather than promotes it. How come?
Well, when you're designing things at the very, very lowest price, or when you're squeezing your suppliers and demanding that they lower and lower their prices, the quickest way to lower price down the supply chain is to lay people off. And it's even more effective if you lay your more skilled and experienced workers off, because they sometimes demand higher wages. So as price becomes more and more paramount, the probability is you're going to lay off some of your most innovative people, your most inexperienced people. And for that reason, that does detract from innovation. If you're competing on price, you want as few people involved as possible, especially as few skilled people involved as possible, and that is what will take away from innovation. But it will possibly increase sales because you can lower your price.
Now, admittedly, this next question delves into the realm of speculation here, but apparently a recent study says tightwads outnumber spendthrifts by a 3-to-2 ratio in America. And I'm wondering if you think that some kind of, hard psychological wiring is at play here in order to bring about a ratio like that.
I think we're self-defined tightwads. We think we're saving money. In fact, I was very, very deal-prone myself before I engaged in this project. I was someone who's very attracted, like a moth to the flame, to any kind of great deal. I thought of myself as a very good shopper, and in fact, very rarely bought, especially clothes that were not on sale or at discount stores. This was something that I was very proud of. But I found in the course of doing this research that, in fact, I was probably spending more money than I would have been if I'd actually been looking at the things I was buying rather than the price first. Psychologists know, I do 2 chapters on psychology in the book and learned an enormous amount. It was fascinating, actually, Psychologists know that people respond to price emotionally. We react emotionally. We think of it as a number, as something that's completely sort of objective, but it's not. It's a very emotional thing. And it's something that we know about an object. We can know the price. We may not know who made it or what it's made of, but we understand the price. So we think we understand what the price means. We respond to low prices very emotionally, and we impulse buy when there's low price, which is part of the reason why when you go to an outlet mall, you tend to spend about 80% more than when you go to a traditional mall, because you see all those brand names, and you assume those brands are the same things that you find at traditional stores, full-price stores, and then you see those very, very low prices, so you tend to over-purchase, and in fact, waste money. And as we know now, the storage units are one of the fastest growing industries in the United States. People have bought so many surplus goods that we need to pay to store them.
I hate to throw a high
So we
and
think of
tight...
ourselves as, you know.
I'm sorry, think of yourselves as what?
Well, we think of ourselves as tightwads, but in fact, historically, at least in the recent past, we have not been tightwads at all. We've been much more spendthrifts than we think.
Gotcha. I hate to throw a high and tight fastball to a fellow Red Sox fan, but you know, I have been reading about your book, and your critics do say that you are an elitist without concern for the needs of the poor or the less aesthetically demanding. And I want to give you a chance to respond to that if you want to.
You know, actually, my critics don't say that. There are some people who have made a good living selling low-price goods, discount goods, and they're the ones who are, of course, my fiercest critics. I don't really understand that argument. Certainly, part of what, you know, my reason, my motivation for doing this book is trying to enlighten Americans about, and Canadians, about value and the idea of being able to achieve value, maintain good jobs at good wages. And that's my argument in the book. So I'm not exactly sure how this is an elitist argument. When I'm suggesting that people think carefully about their purchases, look for quality as well as quantity. And ultimately, of course, they will be saving money if they do that. I've certainly found that to be the case.
Well, let's finish up on this then, because I think you acknowledge that this is a problem for which you don't necessarily offer a solution. You believe in free trade. You don't want to impose tariffs. Are you, at the end of the day, I guess, relying on the enlightened consumer to make socially correct choices?
You know, I think consumers are already starting to turn in that direction, especially young people. They're getting much more interested in things like the food industry. There's been a grassroots movement. They're getting a better understanding of what they purchase, where it's made, who makes it. And I think starting there, we are becoming more enlightened, and we have to be because of the recent economic crisis. All of us are facing decisions that we maybe didn't have to face several years ago, and I think that movement is definitely in that direction. And I can tell you also, the response from industry to the book has been equally interesting. Some have called me in and asked me to consult with them on this issue because they are fully aware that consumers are becoming much more interested in true value versus low price, which we all know can sometimes mask serious problems down the supply chain.
The name of the book is Cheap, The High Cost of Discount Culture. I'm sure it's not cheap to buy, and I'm sure it's worth every penny. Ellen Ruppel, thanks so much for joining us on the line from Boston.
Thank you so much. Take care.